Hello, I'm Jared. I'm going to read Psalm 121. I lift my eyes to the hills. Where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. He will not lead your foot. He will not let your foot slip. He who watches over you will not slumber. Indeed, he who watches over Israel will neither slumber nor sleep. The Lord watches over you. The Lord is your shade at your right hand. The sun will not harm you by day, nor the moon by night. The Lord will keep you from all harm. He will watch over your life. The Lord will watch over your coming and going, both now and forevermore. That's it.
This is the word of the Lord.
This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Thanks be to God.
Well, Christmas 2020 has come and it's gone. I wonder if you've got some very special memories of the occasion of 2020. Of course, many of us would have lots of stories about what had to change all at the last minute because of the COVID situation. As we go back and look at our history of our life, there are many circumstances that we probably can hang our hat on and say, I can remember what I was doing when such and such happened. Now, over this summer series, we're changing now to start looking at some of the Psalms, and they are called Psalms of Ascent because they were psalms that the children of Israel sang as they were going up the mountain to Jerusalem for some of their special celebrations and special holy days. Psalm 121 is one of those songs of ascent. And I want to take you back in time to when the psalm was written. The whole of the psalms come around, not all of them, but most of these psalms are coming around the time of King David. Now, King David lived about 1,000 years before Jesus, which means he lived 1,000 years after Abraham. So he was in the middle of Abraham to Jesus. Do you know, with all of the history of the Israelites in that 1,000 years, they did not have any written record of all of the things that happened with Abraham, with Moses, with the Exodus, the Judges, and all of that early part of the Old Testament of the Bible was all passed on from people to people with what is called oral tradition. Now, these people, the oral givers, would learn the history and would have to repeat that and pass it on and pass it on. And it wasn't until King David that they started to include the written word. They started to just think of all of the Genesis and Exodus and all the other older parts of the Bible, how that was actually passed on by word of mouth. And so it was in David's time that they had this oral tradition, but they started to also write on papyrus, or the paper coming from the papyrus plant that grew prolifically on the River Nile. They had a book that was called the Tanakh, which became the Hebrew Bible, and that was the Law and the Prophets. And the word Tanakh was a combination of three words, which is Torah, the Pentateuch, the 5 books of the Bible, the first 5 books, the Nevi'im, which were the prophets, and then the Ketuvim and the sacred writings. And then added to that are the Proverbs and the Psalms. And so if the screenshot shows you the Tanakh as a whole collection of scrolls written as the original, if you like, Old Testament writings. So when we look at Psalm 121, we start to think, what are we going to look at as we examine these psalms, as we examine these psalms of ascent that the people would sing as a way of learning them, and they were taught it, and so they could sing their history. And especially as they went up to Jerusalem, and the Passover was one of those main festivals that they sang as they went up to Jerusalem. Now, if we look at our slides, the first mountain we see, the mountain that they were going up to, is called Mount Moriah, which is the mountain of the Lord. And you can see on the map, I've circled it, where it is, with Jerusalem about centre of Israel, the land from Dan to Beersheba, which is the promised land. Keeping in mind, it's Abraham, then Moses, 40 years in the wilderness, so it's about 550 years before King David that the first connection came with Jerusalem. And so if you see the picture, it shows you that Jerusalem is on a hill and it's separated by two valleys, and Mount Moriah is a little bit separate to the old city. It's a city called the City of David. In the very early days, it was occupied by a group of people that was called the Jebusites. They were Jebus, that was the name of that original little village. And even the early Jews under Caleb, remember Joshua and Caleb were the two descendants that were able to come right into Israel. Caleb could not occupy it. He couldn't defeat them. And it took King David and his expertise to send his troops up the water ducts to then eventually overtake the Jebusites and to take occupation of this small city on the hill that he renamed Jerusalem, and it was eventually to become the main headquarters of David. This is before the temple. Keep this in mind, the temple hadn't been built, but the Ark of the Tabernacle had been brought, and the tent of the tabernacle was there, and so that it was in the tent in this old city of David that the Jewish people used to come to for their festivals and events as they came up the hill, and everything in Jerusalem is up to Jerusalem. But you know what's significant about it, and this is the important thing. As we look at Psalm 121, it starts off by saying, I will lift up mine eyes to the mountains. From whence cometh my help? Where does my help come from? I'm going to spend today's talk just on mountains and not talk about the other parts. Now you think that's a little bit funny, because he starts to talk about my help is coming from the Lord who made heaven and earth. Well, let's go back just to concentrate on the mountains. And the first mountain, this Mount Moriah, the mountain of the Lord, goes back in history from David 1,000 years. What's the significance? It was on this mountain that Abram was tested into sacrificing his son Isaac after God had made the promise that he was going to make a great nation out of him. And you know, what was to come is that this very place that Isaac was almost sacrificed as a test for Abraham, that is the site that became the home of the temple. And so when David is starting to talk about, I lift up mine eyes to the hills, my eyes to the mountains, where does my help come from? He can go back 1,000 years in memory to know it comes from the same God that was dealing with Abraham and Abraham was believing in. And remember what it said about Abraham? That he believed, and that was recorded to him or credited to him as righteousness. So if David wanted to start looking around him, which we will look around at these significant mountains in the area, the first one, Mount Moriah, is the one that David could say, back in Abraham's time, he proved himself faithful to the Lord and faithful to God. Now, just a little bit south of there, we come to the mountain called Mount Horeb, which is the mountain of God, and that is Mount Sinai. And it's further down, you can see a lot further from Israel. It's below Beersheba, so it's actually now in Egypt country. But it was Mount Sinai that became a very significant mountain in David's time and in the whole of the Israelites' time. But go back to Exodus, and it was at Mount Sinai that God issued the 10 Commandments to Moses. It was at Mount Sinai because Moses was up there for 40 days that the people thought he must have gone. They talked Moses' brother Aaron into building a golden calf, and they started to worship this golden calf instead of this living God, this new God, the God that brought them out of the house of Egypt, from out of slavery, from out of bondage. And it was that same mountain that Moses stood in the gap. And one of the Psalms reflects this. Psalm 160 talks about God was ready to call all things off, had not Moses stood in the gap and pleaded with God and said, "But God, you promised." And so think of David as the king. He could look back to that significant mountain experience that Moses experienced and think, God has promised, God has been faithful, I can apply that to my own life. A little bit after this, and we'll hear about Elijah in a minute, Elijah went to this same mountain as a retreat from Jezebel after the prophets of Baal story, which we'll come across in another mountain's time. But the next mountain I want to share with you is Mount Nebo, which is where Moses saw the promised land. And you can see on the map that Mount Nebo is really just across from Jerusalem, just across the Jordan River. Currently, it is in the country of Jordan, so it's not an Israeli country now, but it was all part and parcel of the one big area at the time, but under different kingdoms and different rules. But God allowed Moses to climb Mount Nebo and look across and see the extent of the promised land. From Dan in the north to Beersheba in the south, he could look across and he could also see Mount Moriah, where the whole Israelite story began. Moses could not enter the promised land because he was a bit impetuous at one stage with the way he dealt with the people, and God said, when it came to striking the rock and commanding water to come out of it, where he was just told to speak to the rock. So God said, you cannot enter the promised land. God's promises were such, his holiness was such, that they had to really be learning to put their full and absolute faith and trust in God and their obedience into God. So, as King David could look across at Mount Nebo, so he also had to realise that he in turn had to be obedient to God and loyal to God. But look at the combinations of Psalm 121 with some of the lessons from Moses. David in Psalm 121 was to say, "The Lord is your shade at your right hand. The sun will not harm you by day, nor the moon by night." In Exodus, he learnt from Moses, when Moses said, as long as Moses held up his hand, the Israelites were winning. So God was with them in a symbolic gesture of Moses' stick, Moses' staff. The Lord will keep you from all harm. He will watch over your life. In Deuteronomy, Moses said to the children of Israel, your clothes did not wear out, and your feet did not swell during these 40 years. Amazing that. 40 years of wandering in the desert, and their clothes did not wear out, but he was also providing for their food, their clothing, and their shelter. The Lord will watch over your coming and going, both now and forevermore. And then Deuteronomy tells us, carefully follow the terms of this covenant so that you may prosper in everything that you do. So let's head across towards the coast, to the Mediterranean Sea coast, a little bit to the north of Jerusalem, a little bit to the west of the Sea of Galilee, to the next mountain, Mount Carmel. Mount Carmel is where Elijah challenged the king and the prophets of Baal. There'd been a drought that Elijah said, he prophesied that there's going to be a drought for the period of time, 6 to 7 years it was happening. And they then had a contest on the top of Mount Carmel where Elijah said, how long will you go limping with two different opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. If the Baal is God, then follow him. Pretty simple, really. And you know, that's our decision today too. Do we follow God? Do we choose to follow God? Or do we just follow our own gods? Now, the rest of the story is there. Psalm 121 tells us that David's history of it is, he who watches over you will not slumber. Indeed, he who watches over Israel will neither slumber nor sleep. And in the contest at Mount Carmel, Elijah was saying to the prophets of Baal, maybe your God is busy, maybe he's sleeping and should be awakened. You see, David could look at Carmel and remember this incident and apply it to his own life. That God was the God of creation. I lift up mine eyes unto the mountains, from whence cometh my help? My help is in the name of the Lord who made heaven and earth. God is the God of creation. You know, the Baals, the worshipping of the god of Baals, they were the god of the environment, of the weather. And so God took them on at their own game. So Mount Carmel is very, very significant to David if he looks at that history of that section. It's just up from Mount Carmel that we come to Mount Tabor. And Mount Tabor is significant for a couple of incidents. One of them was with Gideon, and one of them is with the Song of Deborah. And they are two very spectacular examples of where God was victorious in the defeat of the enemy, and that was part of the Israelites overtaking the enemy to occupy the promised land of God. The Song of Deborah is incredible because the children of Israel were not allowed to create iron things. They were not given the opportunity to use the newfangled iron. The enemy had iron, but then when this flood broke, it was a massive flood. Overnight, Deborah said to Barak, today, Barak, is the day we go. The Lord will be with us. And this flood was such that the whole enemy was drowned. And you read about that in the Song of Deborah, in the whole of the book, in parts of the book of Judges. Nearby is Mount Gilboa and Beth Shan. Now, Mount Gilboa is a sad situation for David. It's a sad memory place because it was on Gilboa that Saul took his own life. His sons were killed. The body was dismembered. They were stuck up on the walls of the country in Beth Shan, of the little village in Beth Shan. So when David looked at that mountain, he was grieved because he had been loyal, even though Saul had been chasing him all his life to destroy him, to kill him. David would not affect or hurt the Lord's anointed. So he could, in grief, still see God's hand in the way it was all handling. Mount Hermon is a little bit to the north, and if you read Psalm 121, he says, from whence cometh my help? Psalm 42 is some collection of words like tears have been my food, my soul, why are you downcast? But he then comes back and he starts to talk about Mount Hermon, the melting snows, the thunderous roar of the water over the waterfalls. God is sort of reminding him that he is an omnipotent God. And so Mount Hermon is mentioned a couple of times in some of the Psalms of David. And then we come back to the last mountain, a very significant mountain, very close to Jerusalem, and that is Mount Olivet, the Mount of Olives. And if you read about David's situation, his son, get this, his son Absalom was mounting a conspiracy to overthrow his father from the throne. And David, in trying to escape from this and knowing what was happening with his advisors and with other people, it describes it there that David continued up the Mount of Olives, and in verse 32 it says where the people used to gather to worship God. He was weeping as he went. His head was covered and he was barefoot. He was in distress. From where does my help come? My help comes from the name of the Lord. I look at this mountain of olives and it reminds me, says David, that this is God still in control and I am in his hand. You know, it's interesting too, isn't it, that the Mount of Olives, it was a place of worship because from the little city of Jerusalem, they had to come down and go across the Kidron River, across the Kidron Brook, up the other side, and that's where the Garden of Gethsemane is. And then it was up in there that they could escape out of the busyness of the city for worship and for prayer and for contemplation. And 1,000 years after that, Jesus and the disciples used the very same mountain for the very same reasons. And so, as we look at Psalm 121, as we look at a song that was written 1,000 years ago, it's beautiful when we read bits of the Bible. It happened a long time ago, it's past tense. It happened to somebody else. It's third party, third person. What we need to do is to make the Bible relevant to our day-to-day life today. So we need to make the Bible first person and present tense. And if we know that Jesus' last words, the very last words before he went to heaven on a cloud, as he is to return one day, he says, "And surely I am with you always to the very end of the age." And what does David say, or what did he say back in 1,000 years before Jesus said those words? "The Lord will watch over your coming and going, both now and evermore." And this image I've got is a very favourite image of mine. It's from Melbourne, the Flinders Street station. But look at the trams, the horse-drawn carts, the people coming and going. How basic can you get between just coming and going from your everyday work experience? So God promises to be with us to the end of the age in our comings and our goings. And I want to make this psalm first person and present tense. And I've changed some words of the psalm, and you see the words that I've changed, they're marked in red. But I want to just finish this chat with you by just going through this psalm, and I want you to go through it with me, and we'll read it and make it our psalm. And at the end of that, Helen is going to play for us that she wrote this psalm to music at a time that she also was like David, looking for the Lord's help. I think I counted 14 uses of the word my after I'd changed the words to yours to mine. So shall we just read this together and make it our prayer and our psalm as we head up to our mountain? Who knows what mountain we're facing? You might be halfway up a mountain now, you might be in the depth of a valley looking to the top. You might be on a mountaintop looking out where you can see a different perspective. But whatever it is, God is with us because he's promised us that he will be with us. So let us just read this together as a prayer and as an application of the psalm. I lift up my eyes to the mountains. Where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. He will not let my foot slip. He who watches over me will not slumber. Indeed, he who watches over Israel will neither slumber nor sleep. The Lord watches over me. The Lord is my shade at my right hand. The sun will not harm me by day, nor the moon by night. The Lord will keep me from all harm. He will watch over my life. The Lord will watch over my coming and going, both now and forevermore. Friends, look to the mountains around us and use that as our vantage point and our stepping off point to learn about putting our faith and our trust in the Lord, who does indeed watch over our comings and our goings.
I will lift my eyes to the hills. You